The Germans called it Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. The Japanese called it two planes, one pilot. The P-38 Lightning was unlike any fighter aircraft ever built. Twin engines were mounted on twin booms, with the cockpit in a central nacelle between them. It looked like something from science fiction. It was fast, heavily armed with four .50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, and it had range that put every other American fighter to shame. The top American ace of World War II, Richard Bong, flew a P-38 and shot down 40 Japanese aircraft. The pilot who killed Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, flew a P-38 on that mission. In the Pacific Theater, the Lightning was a legend. But in Europe, it was a disaster. The P-38 killed American pilots through a design flaw so fundamental that no amount of modification could fix it: compressibility. At high altitude, in a dive, the P-38 could accelerate past the speed of sound in certain parts of its structure, lose all control, and plunge into the ground, killing the pilot before he could recover. The Army Air Forces knew about this problem. They deployed the aircraft anyway, and young men died, not from enemy fighters or flak, but from physics that nobody understood how to solve. The P-38 Lightning was born from ambition and innovation. In 1937, the Army Air Corps issued a specification for a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching 20,000 feet in 6 minutes and achieving a top speed of 360 miles per hour at altitude. These requirements were extraordinary for the time. No single-engine fighter could meet them with existing engines. So Lockheed's chief engineer Hall Hibbard and his assistant Clarence Kelly Johnson came up with a radical solution. Use two engines. Mount them in streamlined nacelles on twin booms that also held the tail surfaces. Place the pilot in a central nacelle between the engines, giving him an unobstructed forward view. Mount all the guns in the nose, eliminating the need to harmonize wing-mounted weapons. It was brilliant. It was also untested and risky. The XP-38 prototype first flew on January 27, 1939, and immediately impressed everyone. It was fast, reaching 400 miles per hour in testing. It climbed like a rocket. The concentrated nose armament was devastating. Lockheed had created something genuinely new, but there were already signs of trouble. That prototype crashed during a transcontinental speed record attempt when the engines quit on approach to Mitchell Field in New York. The pilot survived, but the aircraft was destroyed. Lockheed blamed carburetor icing, made some modifications, and pressed ahead with production. The Army Air Corps ordered 13 YP-38 aircraft for testing, then placed massive production orders as war loomed in Europe. Early production P-38 aircraft had problems immediately. The Allison 5-1710 engines, the same engines that plagued the early P-51 Mustang, were temperamental. But in the P-38, there were two of them, which meant twice the potential for failure. The turbochargers that gave the P-38 its high-altitude performance were unreliable and prone to fire. The counter-rotating propellers were complex and required specialized maintenance. Cockpit heating was inadequate. Pilots flying at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures froze. Frostbite was common. Some pilots lost fingers and toes to cold injury during training flights over the United States before they ever saw combat. But the worst problem, the one that would define the P-38's troubled service in Europe, was compressibility. This was a phenomenon that nobody fully understood in 1941. When an aircraft dives at high speed, airflow over certain parts of the structure can reach the speed of sound, even though the aircraft itself is flying slower than Mach 1. When this happens, the airflow separates, control surfaces become ineffective, and the aircraft enters an uncontrollable dive. For most fighters of the era, this was not an issue because they could not dive fast enough to encounter compressibility. But the P-38, with its clean aerodynamics and heavy weight, could easily reach compressibility speeds in a dive from high altitude. And when it did, the pilot died. The first compressibility accidents happened during training in the United States. Pilots would be practicing high-altitude intercepts, dive on a target, and suddenly find their controls frozen. The control yoke would not respond. The aircraft would continue diving, accelerating past 500 miles per hour, heading straight for the ground. Some pilots managed to recover by desperately pulling back on the yoke with both hands and all their strength, sometimes at altitudes below 5,000 feet. Others were not so lucky. They rode the P-38 into the ground at terminal velocity. The crashes were catastrophic. There was nothing left but a crater and scattered wreckage. Investigators initially blamed pilot error. Then it kept happening. Eventually, engineers realized this was a fundamental aerodynamic problem. Lockheed tried to fix compressibility with dive flaps, small panels under the wing that deployed during high-speed dives to slow the aircraft and help the pilot recover control. The dive flaps helped, but they did not eliminate the problem. They also added weight and complexity. They had to be manually deployed by the pilot, which meant the pilot had to recognize he was in compressibility and react correctly. In combat, with adrenaline pumping and the confusion of a dogfight, pilots did not always remember to deploy the dive flaps. They dove after a German fighter, hit compressibility, and died. The P-38 became known among pilots as an aircraft that would kill you if you made a mistake. When the P-38 deployed to Europe in 1942, the problems multiplied. The 8th Air Force in England operated at extreme altitudes, often above 25,000 feet, in the coldest weather conditions imaginable. The P-38's cockpit heating remained inadequate despite modifications. Pilots flew missions in sub-zero temperatures, their hands and feet going numb, their instrument panels icing over. The Allison engines, designed for American conditions, struggled in the cold, damp European climate. The turbochargers failed constantly. The intercoolers froze. The oil congealed. Engines quit in flight, forcing pilots to limp home on one engine or bail out over the English Channel. The maintenance crews worked miracles keeping P-38 aircraft flying, but the aircraft was simply not suited for European conditions. The tactical situation in Europe also worked against the P-38. The Luftwaffe had excellent high-altitude fighters like the Bf-109 and the FW-190, and they had the advantage of fighting over their own territory. German pilots learned quickly that the P-38 was vulnerable in certain situations. They would bait P-38 pilots into diving after them, knowing that compressibility might kill the American pilot, even if the German did nothing. Or they would attack from above, forcing the P-38 into a defensive dive where compressibility could take over. The Lightning had advantages in a turning fight, but European combat often involved vertical maneuvers where the P-38's flaws became fatal. There was also the issue of range. The P-38 had excellent range compared to single-engine fighters, but escorting bombers to Germany and back pushed the aircraft to its limits. Pilots had to manage fuel carefully, monitor engine temperatures, watch for mechanical problems, and fight the Luftwaffe, all while freezing in an inadequately heated cockpit. The mental and physical strain was enormous. Mistakes happened. Pilots misjudged their fuel consumption and had to ditch in the North Sea. Others pushed their engines too hard, trying to catch up with the bomber stream, and suffered mechanical failures. Some simply got lost in bad weather and ran out of fuel over the ocean. The statistics from Europe tell the story. The P-38 groups in the 8th Air Force had higher losses than P-47 groups and later P-51 groups. Some of those losses were combat casualties, but many were operational losses, engines failing, compressibility accidents, cold weather problems, pilots getting lost and running out of fuel. The P-38 was retired from frontline escort duty in Europe by late 1944, replaced by the P-51 Mustang. The official reason was that the P-51 had better performance and range. The unofficial reason was that the P-38 was killing too many pilots through mechanical failures and design flaws, and commanders had lost confidence in it. But the Pacific theater was a completely different story. In the Pacific, the P-38 thrived. The warm climate was better for the Allison engines. The Japanese fighters, while maneuverable, were not as fast or as heavily armed as German fighters. The long, over-water distances played to the P-38's range advantage, and the missions were different. Pacific combat often involved long-range bomber escort, or fighter sweeps at medium altitudes. Where compressibility was less of an issue, the P-38 became the dominant American fighter in the Pacific, and pilots loved it. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 kills, flew a P-38 named Marge after his girlfriend. Thomas Maguire, the second highest scoring ace with 38 kills, also flew a P-38. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, flew P-38s as a civilian advisor in the Pacific and developed fuel-saving techniques that extended the Lightning's already impressive range. The P-38 shot down more Japanese aircraft than any other Allied fighter. It flew the mission that killed Admiral Yamamoto, intercepting his transport over Bougainville in 1943, a feat of long-range precision navigation that only the P-38 could accomplish. In the Pacific, the fork-tailed Devil earned its fearsome reputation. But even in the Pacific, the P-38 killed American pilots through mechanical failures and accidents. The Allison engines, while more reliable in warm weather, still failed. Pilots flying long over water missions had nowhere to go if an engine quit far from base. They ditched in the ocean and hoped for rescue. Some were saved, many were not. The sharks in the Pacific were efficient, and combat losses were significant. Japanese pilots learned to exploit the P-38's weaknesses, attacking from above or head-on, where the Lightning's size made it an easy target. The P-38 was tough and could absorb damage, but it was not invincible. One of the darkest aspects of the P-38's service was the number of pilots who died in training stateside. The P-38 was a complex aircraft to fly. Twin engines meant twice as many things that could go wrong. The counter-rotating propellers created asymmetric thrust that could kill inexperienced pilots during takeoff or landing if they lost an engine. The compressibility problem killed student pilots who dove too steeply during practice intercepts. The Army Air Forces trained thousands of pilots on P-38s, and the accident rate was horrific. Some training bases lost multiple P-38s per week. The aircraft was unforgiving. It required skill and experience, but the wartime training pipeline rushed pilots through with minimal hours, and they paid the price. There were also quality control issues with production P-38s. Lockheed's Burbank plant and the government-owned plant in Dallas churned out thousands of Lightnings, but not all of them were built to the same standards. Some aircraft had structural defects that were not caught during inspection. Rivets were not properly set. Welds were incomplete. These defects occasionally caused catastrophic failures. Wings separated in flight. Tail booms cracked. Pilots died because some factory worker had a bad day, or a supervisor skipped an inspection to meet production quotas. It did not happen often, but it happened enough to be a problem. The P-38 also had a high-speed stall problem that was distinct from compressibility, but equally dangerous. At high speeds in certain configurations, the wing would stall without warning, causing the aircraft to snap roll and enter a spin. Recovery was possible if the pilot recognized what was happening and reacted correctly, but in combat, pilots did not always have time to think. They would be maneuvering hard, fighting for their lives, and suddenly the P-38 would snap and spin. Some pilots recovered, others augured into the ground or the ocean. By 1944, Lockheed had addressed many of the P-38's problems. The later models, particularly the P-38J and P-38L, had improved cockpit heating, more reliable engines, better dive flaps, and hydraulically boosted ailerons that improved high-speed handling. These improvements made the P-38 a much better fighter. But they came too late for the hundreds of pilots who had died in earlier models. Even the improved version still had limitations. The P-38 never became as dominant in Europe as the P-51 Mustang, and by 1945 it was being phased out of frontline service in favor of newer designs. After the war ended, the P-38 was quickly retired. The military had little use for a twin-engine fighter when jet aircraft were coming online. Most P-38s were scrapped or sold as surplus. A few were converted to photo reconnaissance aircraft or used for experimental purposes, but the vast majority were cut up for aluminum. Today, only a handful of airworthy P-38s remain. They appear at air shows, and crowds marvel at the distinctive twin-boom design. But the crowds do not know about the compressibility accidents. They do not know about pilots who froze to death in inadequately heated cockpits. They do not know about training crashes, engine failures, or design flaws that killed hundreds of young Americans. The legacy of the P-38 Lightning is split between two realities. In the Pacific, it was a war-winning fighter that dominated the Japanese and became the mount of America's top aces. In Europe, it was a troubled aircraft that killed its own pilots and was withdrawn from service because commanders lost confidence in it. Both realities are true. The P-38 was capable of brilliance in the right conditions, but it was also deeply flawed and unforgiving in the wrong conditions. That is not a comfortable narrative, so history often focuses on the Pacific successes and downplays the European failures. The engineers who designed the P-38 were not incompetent. Kelly Johnson went on to design the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, and the SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest aircraft ever built. He was a genius. But in 1937, when the P-38 was being designed, nobody understood compressibility. The wind tunnels of the era could not simulate transonic airflow, and the theory of supersonic aerodynamics was still being developed. The P-38 was designed without knowledge of problems that would kill pilots 5 years later. That is not malice or negligence. It is the risk of pushing technology into unknown territory. The Army Air Forces did know about the compressibility problem by 1942. They knew pilots were dying in training accidents. They knew the P-38 was dangerous in high-speed dives. And they deployed it to Europe anyway, because they needed every fighter they could get. That decision cost lives. Young men died because commanders sent them into combat in an aircraft with known fatal flaws, hoping that skill and luck would keep them alive. Some made it. Many did not. The pilots who flew the P-38 in combat were brave. They climbed into an aircraft that they knew could kill them through mechanical failure or design flaws, and they fought anyway. Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire became legends. But for every famous ace, there were dozens of unknown pilots who died in P-38s, shot down by the Japanese or the Germans, killed in compressibility accidents, lost over the ocean after engine failures, frozen to death in cockpits during high-altitude missions over Europe. These men deserve to be remembered. They were not aces. They were not famous. But they died just as dead as anyone else. The final truth about the P-38 Lightning is that it was a brilliant concept with tragic execution. The twin-engine fighter layout gave it range and firepower that single-engine designs could not match. But it also introduced complexity, maintenance problems, and aerodynamic issues that killed pilots. The concentrated nose armament was devastating when it worked. The twin engines provided redundancy and safety. Unless you lost one on takeoff, an asymmetric thrust killed you. The distinctive appearance made it instantly recognizable, which was great for identification, but also made it an easier target for enemy fighters. Every advantage came with a corresponding disadvantage. In the Pacific, Where conditions favored the P-38's strengths, it became a legend. In Europe, where conditions exposed its weaknesses, it was a failure. The same aircraft produced two completely different outcomes, based entirely on circumstances. That tells you something important about weapon systems. There is no such thing as a perfect weapon. Every design is a series of compromises and trade-offs. The P-38 traded simplicity and ease of maintenance for range and firepower. It traded low-altitude performance for high-altitude capability. It traded forgiving handling for speed. Those trade-offs made sense on paper, but they killed pilots in practice. The P-38 Lightning helped win World War II. In the Pacific theater, it was essential. Long-range missions, fighter sweeps, bomber escorts, and photo reconnaissance all depended on the P-38's unique capabilities. The Yamamoto mission alone justified the aircraft's existence. But in Europe, the P-38 was withdrawn from frontline service and replaced by better aircraft. And throughout its service in both theaters, the P-38 killed American pilots through compressibility, engine failures, cold weather problems, and an unforgiving flight envelope that punished mistakes with death. This is the tragic story of the Fork-tailed Devil, a revolutionary design that promised to change air combat. An aircraft that became a legend in the Pacific and a liability in Europe. It made aces out of skilled pilots, and it killed average pilots who made mistakes. The P-38 was not a bad aircraft, but it was a dangerous one, and the young men who flew it paid the price for its flaws. That is the truth. That is what should be remembered, not just the victories and the aces, but the training accidents, the compressibility deaths, and the pilots who froze to death at altitude. Glory and tragedy, inseparable, forever linked in the story of the Lightning.